Yes, civil violation. Implicit citizenship revoked. Status, malignant.
explosive barrel factory.
This room, filled with an absurd number of exploding barrels, inspired some good-natured debate within the team around how far to push the plausibility of our world. Frankly, one exploding barrel is probably too many in regards to realism. In the real world, barrels really shouldn't explode, even if you were to shoot them.
Rising water. The floating bridge and wooden spools here introduce the concept of buoyancy as a tool for the player. In this case, it's not really a puzzle. It's just some fun for the player interacting with the physics system. But later, we revisit this gameplay element in the canals to raise a ramp for the airboat.
Rendering systems. In the early 2000s, we couldn't afford a general-purpose renderer with the broad capabilities of a modern engine. Instead, CPU, GPU, and memory limitations required highly specific solutions to rendering challenges so we could squeeze every bit of performance out of a player's hardware. As a result, Half-Life 2 actually has 3 different rendering engines. One for world geometry, another for outdoor terrain, and a third for dynamic entities like characters and objects. These 3 renderers had to support a complicated matrix of features: collisions, ray traces, decals, offline lighting, visibility calculations, and more. On top of that, each renderer needed to support DirectX 7, 8, and 9. The differences among these DirectX versions were significant, often requiring different data storage and rendering approaches. They even used different programming languages. Altogether, we essentially had 9 different renderers, each needing unique solutions, and getting them all to look consistent was one of the most challenging tech problems we faced during development.
GPU Wild West. During development, we faced numerous decisions influenced by our choice of minimum spec, the least powerful CPU and GPU combination that would still deliver a good experience for customers. In the early 2000s, there was far more variety among GPUs than today, with wide differences not only in speed, but in fundamental approaches to rendering. But at the time, we had no real data on the hardware our customers were using. What CPUs and GPUs did they have? How much RAM? Which version of Windows? We reached out to Microsoft hoping they might know answers to questions like, how many DX7 cards are in use? Or DX8? Unfortunately, they didn't have the data either. Realizing we were at risk of making bad decisions without these insights, we developed an analysis tool that allowed players to report their hardware specs to us and integrated it into the early version of Steam. The data was so useful that we decided to make it public, launching the Steam Hardware Survey in April 2003. It's been helping us and hopefully other developers make informed decisions ever since.
Hey! You're Freeman, aren't you? We got word you were coming. You got here at a bad time.
Black Mesa East to Station 6. Do you read? Dr. Freeman is on his way downriver. Lend him the airboat and give him all the help you can. Repeat, Gordon Freeman has returned. It is critical he reaches Black Mesa East.
We've got some ammo in those crates over there. Help yourself to supplies and keep moving.
Dynamic shadows. With a focus on character and physics objects, we felt a dynamic shadow system was necessary to render them all in all their glory. In 2003, GPUs didn't have any dedicated shadow capabilities that they have today, so performance was a tricky problem. Our eventual solution went something like this, running every frame. First, find all the objects that might have shadows in view. Doing this meant figuring out which objects were in the view frustum, or slightly behind it, to catch entities that were off-screen but whose shadows might end up on-screen. Then we'd render a black shadow version of each one of those objects into a single shadow texture. For that render, we'd use the lowest level of detail model for the object to be as fast as possible. Finally, we'd use the shadow texture to draw each of the shadows into the player's view, darkening the already rendered pixels. We carefully cut around each shadow in that shadow texture to ensure that they correctly overlaid each other in the case where multiple shadows overlap. It's neat to look back on how we did these things, but ultimately we're a lot happier today, where GPU hardware makes it a much more straightforward problem.
Headcrab canisters. Used headcrab canisters are seen later in Ravenholm, so we decided to show them here to tell the story of how they're used by the Combine. The story is that the Combine have weaponized Zen fauna to use them against the humans. Burrowed headcrabs was added as a new feature for this section that was expanded into a larger area that is meant to show a citizen shanty that was decimated by the headcrab assault.
Hey, Dr. Freeman. I've been hoping you'd show up. Got this airboat all gassed up and ready to go. It's gonna be tough dodging civil protection out there in the open, but drive hard and you'll make it. You'll find more help up at Station 7. Just a few bends up the river. It's the old red barn. Climb on in. Fire her up. Go ahead and get in the boat, Dr. Freeman. Get in the airboat, sir. Get in the airboat, sir. Get in the airboat, sir.
Airboat intro. This is where the player gets the first vehicle of the game, the airboat. We wanted to create a safe space for players to practice driving the airboat for as long as they wanted before moving on. The arena is sprinkled with opportunities for jumps and tricks, and we filled the arena with toxic slime to keep players in the airboat longer, while preventing them from leaving the vehicle behind and progressing forward on foot.
Go ahead and
Combinatorial shader explosion. Rendering became much more complex during Half-Life 2's development with the addition of hardware shaders, small bits of code controlling how each pixel on a surface should render. In 2003, shaders were far more limited than today. Half-Life 2 era shaders lacked conditionals and had severe code size restrictions. This meant no if-else branching logic to adjust based on different conditions, and no large shaders with broad feature sets. Also, compiling shaders as needed was just too slow to be useful, so we had to pre-compile them. To work within these limits, we had to compute every possible shader combination and store each one individually as its own shader. For example, if a shader affected a surface based on a single light source, we'd need another shader version for 2 lights, another for 3, and so on. And it was combinatorial. If that shader also supported a normal map, we'd need 2 versions per light, one with a normal map and one without. With features like texture blending, vertex tinting, specular highlights, alpha testing, and various other light types, directional point and spotlights, our shader count exploded. By release, we had thousands of individual shaders. Shortly after, we released Lost Coast, adding HDR support, which doubled the shader count again. Once compiling shaders on the local developer's machine started taking too long, we switched to distributing the shader compiles over the entire network using VMPI. We also had a dynamic shader compilation mode that was useful for developing shaders that gave fast turnaround at the expense of frame rate hitching when a shader had to be compiled.
Fighting motion sickness. In early playtesting, many players developed motion sickness while driving the airboat. While trying to fix this, we discovered several factors that contributed to it. We found that reducing the intrusion of the airboat into the view helped, so we made several passes on the model to pare it back. Maintaining a consistent frame rate helped as well, so it was important to keep an eye on performance in these sections. However, the single most important factor was eliminating view roll to maintain a more stable horizon no matter what the airboat was doing. One of the programmers on the team was super prone to motion sickness, and they valiantly offered to playtest several times to test our progress towards a solution. I'm pretty sure they threw up at least once after playtesting, and their noble sacrifice was hugely appreciated.
Airboat time. Finding the right balance between vehicle time and time on foot took some work. Driving at full speed propelled players through the world quickly, and in early playtests we felt that players were missing out on exploring and taking in the game's detail. Exploration and world examination are core values of Half-Life, so we didn't want the vehicle to eliminate that. To address this, we added periodic spots where players could get out and explore small pockets of dense detail. Additionally, as the physics system evolved, we were learning new ways to use it. These spots off the airboat let us introduce an element of discovery around physics, like dropping crates into the water or combining barrels to raise a ramp. This gave players a chance to interact with water and physics in different ways.
Floating supplies. In the alpha playtest, the canals were sprinkled with floating supply crates that players could smash with the airboat to collect the supplies inside. The mechanics were somewhat gamey, but helped keep the flow of the gameplay going, allowing the player to resupply on the go. To help make the premise more plausible, we wanted to tell the story of how the floating crates ended up so conveniently placed along the player's path. This scene of the citizens dropping supply crates helped sell that fiction, while also making the canals feel more alive. It also made players feel more heroic and important to be helped by so many supporting characters.
one who has acquired an almost messianic reputation in the minds of certain citizens. His figure is synonymous with the darkest urges of instinct, ignorance, and decay. Some of the worst excesses of the Black Mesa incident have been laid directly at his feet. And yet unsophisticated minds continue to imbue him with romantic power, giving him such dangerous poetic labels as the one free man, the opener of the way. Let me remind all citizens of the dangers of magical thinking. We have scarcely begun to climb from the dark pit of our species' evolution. Let us not slide backward into oblivion, just as we have finally begun to see the light. If you see this so-called free man, report him. Civic deeds do not go unrewarded, and contrariwise, complicity with his cause will not go unpunished. Be wise. Be safe. Be aware.
Grenade intro. We conceived of this Combine base as both a training area and a playground for grenades, introducing them here in infinite supply crates to signal that it's safe for players to use grenades freely without fear of running out. Go wild. The Combine encounter here uses extensive markup to direct the soldier AI towards cover and provide good opportunities for players to make use of grenades. At the end of the area, the same infinite grenade technique helps players resolve the turret placement, as a direct assault is a lot more difficult if you don't. A bright red light and a particle trail were added to the grenades, making it significantly easier for players to follow their trajectory, whether they're throwing them or dodging one from a Combine soldier.
Air resistance. One important feature we had to add to our physics engine for Half-Life 2 was air resistance. At the time, physics engines would typically implement a general damping feature for slowing objects down as they moved, but this merely removes energy in a symmetric way. In order to create more believable motion, we decided to simulate air resistance instead. This allowed us to get asymmetric behavior, where the amount the object was slowed by moving through the air was different depending on how much surface area of the object was facing the direction of movement or rotation. This feature was key to making explosions and objects thrown by the gravity gun look believable. Fast-moving and fast-spinning objects are among the most expensive things to simulate in Half-Life 2's physics engine, so air resistance also improves CPU performance in cases like explosions. It is also key to presenting different materials and masses of objects. More dense objects can push aside air more easily, and this is visible. Having this effect in the simulation helps make the difference in density between cardboard boxes and wooden planks more apparent, and really helps make the objects in Half-Life 2's world much more convincing.
puzzle layers. Because players are often totally unaware of the designer's intent, which we think is a good thing, they tend to respond in all kinds of surprising ways to our puzzles. Even seemingly simple puzzles can see countless failures along the way to success. That was the case with this puzzle to open the canal gates, which required many layers of hints and cues. The sparking wheel communicates that this is where someone would normally open the gate, but some other method is needed. A few crows draw the player's eye towards the solution, in this case, a bundle of girders on a pendulum. As grenades have been thoroughly introduced, we originally wanted players to throw one to break the wooden support structure, but that wasn't obvious enough. We added exploding barrels as a much clearer clue. But even after solving the puzzle, some players didn't realize that the gates were now open, which led them to endlessly explore the base interior looking for another exit. So we had to remind them of their original problem, the broken gate. We added smoke, the alarm klaxon, and a spinning light, and it was then that we finally started seeing reliably good results in playtesting.
Metrocop strafing. The initial design of the airboat levels aimed to challenge players with tight maneuvers under pressure from Metrocops. The Metrocop strafing fire pattern was meant to make players slalom around the shots as they sped through, but in a review process, internally known as Overwatch, some playtesters felt frustrated being shot at without a way to retaliate. They wanted the airboat to feel powerful and unstoppable. Based on that feedback, we refocused the levels to emphasize empowerment over challenge, shifting from dodging attacks to fast-paced combat, speed, and busting through barriers.
57 intro. The Magnum, unlike the basic handgun with its slower rate of fire, is meant to be fired in a more measured, calculated way, dealing catastrophic damage to your target. Earlier versions of the Magnum had a bit of random dispersion, which we felt fit the heft and the less sensitive trigger pull of a larger pistol. However, this led to anticlimactic moments where players would carefully line up a shot only to miss due to the accuracy penalty. To address this, we made the first bullet perfectly accurate, with each subsequent shot becoming less accurate as you blasted away.
VMPI. During development, we became increasingly frustrated with our slow gameplay iteration speeds, mainly because map compilation, needed to pre-compute lighting and visibility, was taking hours. Computers in 2000 were far slower than today's, and they had only a single CPU core each. Inspired by SETI at Home, a distributed program that used PCs worldwide to analyze radio waves for signs of extraterrestrial life, we built VMPI, which was our own distributed system that spread the map compilation process across many office computers. Today, these kinds of distributed systems run on giant GPU clusters, but at the time we just ran it on all the computers in our office. To deal with how our lighting code was evolving as quickly as our maps were, VMPI also distributed new exe files to everyone's computer too. In retrospect, this was a pretty terrifying security concept, just awfully bad. It's like the stuff of nightmares for IT folks, because we were sending an arbitrary executable to all of our work PCs and they would just run it. It was absolute madness. But it worked for us, and it did significantly increase our map iteration speed, and as a result, it ended up being a crucial tool.
Mounted gun. The mounted guns were added here to help train the player on the gun's effectiveness against the attack helicopter for the final battle in the reservoir. This was necessary because up to this point, the helicopter was invulnerable to the player's weapons, and we had to give some indication that it could be harmed with larger weaponry. This was only somewhat effective in playtest due to the amount of pressure the player was under at the moment, which led us to developing the particle effects and sounds that would sell to the players that they were really doing damage.
3D Skybox. We've always needed to render a world that feels larger than our map limitations allow. In Half-Life 1, we used a cube map texture to let players see beyond the playable area. But in Half-Life 2, we wanted that view into the larger world to be dynamic, not just a static texture. Our map size limitation was about half a mile in each dimension, but we realized we could create a much larger outer world if we stored it at a reduced scale. So, we invented what we called the 3D Skybox. The 3D Skybox is a small box hidden within the actual game map containing geometry at 1/16th scale. Inside it, a reference point corresponds to a matching origin in the main map. Then, when we render the space beyond the playable area, we use the geometry from the 3D Skybox, positioned by that reference point and scaled up 16 times. Getting the lighting and fog to blend seamlessly across the transition from the main map to the Skybox presented some sticky challenges, but it worked. The result made the world feel significantly larger and more immersive than it had in Half-Life 1.
Helicopter bombing run. This is another example of us creating movement hazards while driving the airboat. The helicopter attempts to stay in front of the player when dropping bombs, and if the player backtracks, it switches to hovering and turns to attacking the player. In one playtest, a bomb just so happened to drop between the pipe seams, creating a pretty cinematic moment. The playtester had a positive reaction, so the team decided to script it so it happened every time. This process has become part of our organic design process. Every so often, a cool thing randomly happens in a playtest. We find a way to make it happen more reliably.
smokestack collapse. When making a cinematic action game like the first Half-Life, we'd always wanted to make some big, spectacular destruction sequence, but we were never quite able to do anything like that. Half-Life 2's physics introduced a system for breaking physics small objects, such as crates, into pieces, which provoked the idea of doing something much bigger. We took a leap and tried breaking a smokestack into pieces as it fell. So we experimented with the masses until it felt better, refined the model, and added lots of smoke and audio to sell the effect. And there we had it. We had our big spectacular destruction moment. Ultimately, our physics made the sequence just barely possible in a way that maybe seems quaint by modern standards, but felt really awesome at the time. Because the simulation was unique every time we ran it, we had to take steps to avoid completely blocking the player's path with the big chunks of debris. The success of this sequence whet our appetites for the much higher fidelity cinematic physics destruction effects next seen in Episode 2.
Displacements 1. After Half-Life 1 shipped, our level designers and artists wanted a better solution for outdoor environments, so we built the first version of our terrain system. It was based on subdivided quads. To visualize this, imagine a flat square divided into a grid, where each point on the grid can be moved up or down. Level designers could lay out multiple squares and then use a paintbrush tool to shape hills and valleys by adjusting the grid points. For rendering, we used a special blended texture, which combined two different textures. Each grid point specified how much of each texture to use, allowing smooth transitions between surfaces like sand, grass, dirt, and gravel. This type of terrain system wasn't unusual in game engines at the time, and we naively thought it would be enough for our game designers.
Washing machine puzzle. We created the washing machine physics puzzle late in development, after playtesting indicated that players needed some downtime from the relentless pressure from the helicopter. Pacing contrasts like this can accentuate the high moments by resetting the player's emotional state and warding off exhaustion or even boredom. It was a positive sign that players reacted so strongly to all the work done to make the helicopter truly menacing, but if we didn't manage the stress of it, fatigue set in, which quickly started to feel like monotony rather than excitement. Originally, players quickly drove through this area, but because of the nice sunlight and composition of the canal here, we decided it was a good spot to pause the action and have the player spend some quiet time solving a puzzle. The puzzle itself, which was the first to use masses and pulleys, ended up giving rise to other physics navigation puzzles elsewhere in the game.
Displacements, 2. Once the initial terrain system was up and running, we expected level designers to use it for outdoor spaces. Instead, they began experimenting, adding detail in unexpected places. They used the subdivided quads on the top of walls to create ruined edges, rounded off street curbs, and even attempted to make pipes. This met with varying success since the terrain system was designed for landscapes, not architectural detail. So we returned to the code mines, transforming the height-based terrain system into a fully 3D displacement system. Now, instead of only moving grid points up and down, designers could move them in any direction. This allowed them to add extra detail to all kinds of surfaces using blended textures to smooth transitions between the displacement quads and the BSP geometry. However, this required additional tech work to ensure consistent lighting between the two renderers, or those edges would have been noticeably mismatched. But with all this done, the level designers seemed satisfied, and we naively thought that this time it really would be enough. Displacements, 3. With the general displacement system in hand, level designers didn't stop at adding detail to the world and returned to their original goals of building large-scale outdoor sections. This led to another round of updates to balance performance, ensuring the system could handle both fine detail and larger ground terrain. Texturing had to improve as well, especially to support complex structures like overhanging cliffs that weren't possible with the original height-based system. Designers, never one to rest on their laurels, also started using displacements to create caves and tunnels. While these additions looked great, they required even more technical adjustment. Eventually, we managed to wrangle the competing requirements of all the ways that displacements were being used, and they shipped in large sections of our game world. Looking back, displacements are a clear example of how technology and game design evolve together. It's a chicken and egg problem. We can't foresee all the ways a piece of tech will impact the game, but we also can't build the tech without knowing what it needs to accomplish. So, as is always the case, we have to build something. We start with a solid guess and see where it leads us.
Minor fracture detected.
Aren't you?
Well, I wouldn't believe it if I couldn't see it with my own eyes. Dr. Gordon Freeman himself.
Just in time, Doc. We gotta move out before the Combine picks us up. We're just getting ready to pull out.
We better hurry. Gotta tear down this.
Greetings to the Freeman.
Come on in. I'll show you what you're up against. Get in here. Here, take a look at this. This here's the dam. It's just up ahead. Eli's hideout is here, a stone's throw from the apron and nestled in the old hydro plant. But getting there, with that hunter chopper on your ass, next to impossible. Good news is, the Vortigaunt's working his magic on your airboat, so you'll have a little more firepower going forward. I think he's just finishing up now. Go on out.
Gestures. Each of our characters had a library of simple animations called gestures, which we could easily layer on top of other body movements. While originally planned as a production savings to allow us to reuse animations throughout the game, we found they actually had more utility than that. Humans often repeat certain movements, and these can be markers of a specific personality. As a result, our gestures library ended up capturing the essence of each character, helping to unify our animation team's understanding of who those characters were. This made it much easier for our animators to share any one character's workload among themselves, which production often required.
There we are. That gun came off one of the same hunter choppers that you're up against. I always like to bring a little iron into a firefight. Take that chopper down, and you should be able to tear on through to Eli's place.
The Freeman will accept this weapon or suffer greatly on the road ahead.
Farewell, Dr. Freeman.
Give him hell, Doc.
Airboat changeup. We heard from the playtesters that they wanted more varied gameplay from the airboat. Up until this point of the game, the player had no real way to fight back against the helicopter and other enemies, so it felt right to introduce a new weapon and in turn deliver a pacing change and set the stage for what would come next. In the subsequent areas, we added target practice to acquaint people with their new weapon. Extra physics force on the airgun projectiles meant targets would get sent flying and make it feel way more powerful than anything in the player's loadout. Even then, when it came to playtesting combat against the helicopter, a lot of testers still thought it was invincible and hadn't noticed our efforts to illustrate that it was taking damage from the Combine-mounted guns earlier. To get over this, we did the most obvious thing. We put the helicopter directly outside the tunnel in which you get the gun and make it extremely clear that you can and should shoot it. And it worked.
Skybox time of day. The skybox and fog color changes incrementally during this chapter. This is meant to visually represent the passage of time as the player journeys through the canals and the chapter. Two fog color values in opposite directions help sell the illusion of the oblique angle of the sun. You can see it getting closer to sunset by this point. This culminates in the helicopter combat arena with the sun setting and Ravenholm visible in the skybox.
Donkey Kong Barrel Ramp. This particular area, the drainage ramp, originally started as just an interesting piece of level architecture. But during playtesting, we quickly saw how fun it was to slide the airboat up and around the slope, so we added more elements to enhance that experience. This included Metro Cops dropping barrels down toward the player, and a little nod to the classic arcade game, Donkey Kong.
Helicopter Megabomb Origin. The Megabomb helicopter attack was based on a bug where a programmer accidentally removed the bomb drop cooldown, resulting in the chopper dropping hundreds of bombs all at once. It looked so cool that we decided that we had to keep it for the final shipping bombing run attack.
Arena exit gate. The wheel mechanism to raise the exit gate was added specifically to force the player to defeat the helicopter before they can move forward. We often refer to elements like this as gating the player, using design elements to keep them from progressing until they've completed a necessary task. Here, it's quite literally a gate.
Helicopter Final Battle. We designed this area as the arena for the final showdown between the player and the Combine attack helicopter. It's the player's chance to finally eliminate the relentless enemy that's been hunting them since fleeing underground after leaving Kleiner's lab. This area went through many iterations to get right. It needed ample space for fast-paced vehicle combat, a smooth movement flow with clear path options, and reliable performance. We also aimed for visual clarity suited to combat, striking but not overly noisy, while ensuring it would serve as a memorable vista once the helicopter is destroyed.
Airboat wreckage. Originally, we destroyed the airboat in the jump over the dam, so this level opened with the player amidst the wreckage of their beloved airboat. In a team-wide playtest, people felt disappointed to lose the vehicle they had spent so much time in. There was a lot of internal debate about whether that feeling of loss was a valuable experience or not. Ultimately, we decided to leave the airboat intact, to allow for the possibility of the player reuniting with it someday. Some say that airboat is still out there, waiting for you.
Alex and Mossman. In our early plans for Half-Life 2's narrative, we wanted to take on the challenge of doing something less explicitly game-focused. Not just a story about the obviously good player defeating the obviously evil enemies. Instead, we aimed to focus on characters and their relationships. We thought it would be interesting to explore family as a central dynamic unit of Half-Life 2. The tension between Alex and Mossman emerged from that idea, and we liked it because it felt relatable, something players could understand and empathize with.
We've got something. Okay, it's human. Hello? Take it easy in there. You're safe now. You'll have to forgive the scanning process. We can't take any chances. Dr. Freeman? Gordon Freeman? Is that you? You've made it here this quickly. Well, Eli is going to be amazed, not to mention relieved. I'm Dr. Mossman, Dr. Judith Mossman. I've been hearing about you since long before the Black Mesa incident. Oh, Black Mesa. I do so envy you working with Eli and Dr. Kleiner when they were at the top of their field. Ah, there we go. You can come through now. I'll take you down to Eli right away. He would never forgive me if I kept you waiting.
Good to know you. You'd better get going.
We could certainly use the extra help around here. We've covered a lot of ground in the last few months, but things would go so much faster if we had more people with your training. We're closing in on a reliable local teleport technology, something the Combine still hasn't mastered. Eli thinks their portals are string-based, similar to our Calabi-Yau model, but they've failed to factor in the dark energy equations. They can tunnel through from their universe, but once they're here, they're dependent on local transportation. If they knew what we were doing with entanglement... Oh. Listen to me. I sound like a postdoc. I'm just so excited to think that we'll finally have the chance to work together. Where was I? Oh, yes. Dr. Kleiner compressed the Zen relay far beyond anything he imagined at Black Mesa. We've figured out how to use Zen as an unexpressed axis, effectively a dimensional slingshot, so we can swing around the border world and come back in local space without having to pass through. Oh, here's Eli now.
All right, good. You keep right on.
Eli, look who I found in the airlock.
Gordon Freeman. Let me get a look at you, man. My God, you haven't changed one iota. How do you do it? Now, let's see. The last time I saw you, I sent you up for help after the resonance cascade. I never thought it would take you this long to get back to me. Welcome to the lab, anyway. It's not Black Mesa, but it served us well enough.
It's going to be a lot more like Black Mesa with Gordon here to help.
Right you are. MIT graduates are few and far between these days. We'll get you out of that hazard suit and back into your lab coat where you belong.
Let me just finish up some work and I'll see what I can dig up. Dr. Freeman, it's been a real honor. I'm looking forward to working together.
Feel free to look around.
Eli's lab. We built Eli's lab after Dr. Kleiner's, which gave us a better understanding of how to set up and design effective choreo scenes. As a result, we were able to create a more complex scenario with more opportunities for it to respond to the player. Having multiple characters doing their own thing around the room made staging tricky, and it took a lot of iteration and playtesting to get it to run smoothly. Our experience showed that, generally, players wanted to play along with the scene. They just needed enough subtle clues to know where we wanted them. Similarly, if they got distracted, the scene had to gently pause and wait for them to return. Feel free to look around. Balancing the player's desire to explore with the narrative goals of the scene was always a challenge. We wanted the room to be full of interesting things to look at, but many players wouldn't explore until they were sure they wouldn't miss any of the character performances. That's why it was important for Eli to tell the player to look around midway through the scene. It signaled that it was safe to explore. From there, we could trigger a variety of custom mini-scenes based on what caught the player's interest.
You remember my wife, Ozian, don't you? That picture and Alex were all I managed to carry out of Black Mesa. Dr. Breen. He's the administrator of this whole vile business now. He ended the 7 Hours War by managing Earth's surrender. The Combine rewarded him with power. We've almost got that portal working again. But I wouldn't blame you if you didn't volunteer for the next trial run.
Oh, Dr. Freeman, you should stay with Eli. Go on. I'll rejoin you shortly.
Fine scientist, Judith. She was up for your job at Black Mesa, but you edged her out with your Innsbruck experience.
Oh, Gordon. The Vortigaunt said you were here. I can't believe you made it so quickly on foot.
I believe he broke your record, honey.
Well, he earned it. I guess you proved you can handle yourself out there.
There's nothing Gordon can't handle, with the possible exception of you.
Dad, please.
Take a look at this, Gordon.
Alex, I thought you were on watch.
The Vortigaunts relieved me so I could come see Gordon. Anyway, I should be in here working on the portal.
I have the repairs well in hand. Someone misjudged the capacity of the Combine thyristor.
Are you blaming me?
No, not at all. It was a calculation error, not a mechanical problem.
Then maybe you should let me do the calculations next time as well as installing it.
Alex, really? Sometimes I think you deliberately misunderstand me.
Alex, why don't you take Gordon along and give him some practice with the gravity gun?
Sure. Come on, Gordon. Let's go have some fun.
The zero-point energy field manipulator is not a toy, Alex.
Ugh, let's get out of here.
See you in a little while, Gordon.
Hugs and pickups. Sometimes even little things can be a nightmare to get working. For example, getting a character to hug another character, or even more simply, just to pick up an object from a table, can cause a lot of issues. Even worse, in our dynamic environment, where the characters and objects aren't in preset positions, and the players running around getting in the way, these require a level of synchronization that can be quite tricky. They're made harder because humans handle them without thinking. As you're moving to the table to pick up a cup, you're doing all kinds of preparation with your body to get your feet and hands in the right position to allow to do it comfortably, everything ready right when you get there. If you're moving in to hug somebody, you're both doing it at the same time, adjusting constantly based on each other's movement. To get these features to work in the game involved a lot of synchronization work, making characters aware of each other and the world, and at the same time, getting them to know more about their future plans. It's tempting to want to break up pick up a cup example into discrete steps. Walk to the table, face cup, pick up a cup, because it's much simpler that way, and it makes the steps nicely reusable. But that's how robots work, not humans. Our characters had to know they were moving to a table with the intention to pick up a cup, so they could work on multiple parts of it simultaneously, making sure their hand grabs the cup right when they get there. With two characters, it's even more of a negotiation. Both need to agree where and when it's going to happen, and everything needs to happen in place in a seamless fashion. While these moments of simple interaction with their characters in the world are often short, they were critical to making them seem like believable people.
We want to put this dense chunk of visual story here because it's the place the game is most explicit
at telling players to explore space. Even though its primary job is world building, we still take strides to highlight the relationship between Eli and Breen, giving context to the world's central conflict.
Go ahead, Gordon. We'll catch up with you later.
So I see you've met Dr. Mossman. She's one of the main reasons I spend so much time outside. You should hear her drone on about how it should have been her in the Black Mesa test chamber that day. I'm sorry, I shouldn't be talking behind her back. It just gets a bit claustrophobic down here. That's the old passage to Ravenholm.
Mossman. Judith Mossman was originally based on a character we had planned for a section of Half-Life 1. That section was cut from the base game and reused in Uplink, but without the character. We consider her the most complex character in Half-Life 2. We knew we'd be walking a tightrope with how the player felt about her even before Nova Prospekt, because the player's trusted sources don't agree. Eli likes her, but Alex doesn't. We recognized there was a limit to how much complexity we could pull off in relationships, but we felt that a stepmother-daughter dynamic was something players would understand. Whether or not you agree with Mossman, she's doing something heroic. She risks being a double agent to get the information she needs to protect Eli and Alex. She just didn't plan for Gordon.
That's the old passage to Ravenholm. We don't go there anymore. Come on. So, here we are. The scrapyard. This is a gravity gun my father was talking about. You can call it the zero-point energy field manipulator if you really want to. It's designed for handling hazardous materials, but we mainly use it for heavy lifting. Give it a try. The primary trigger emits a charge. You can punch stuff and send it flying. I found it handy for clearing minefields.
Character lighting.
The secondary trigger lets you grab things. You can throw them with the primary. Once you've picked something up, you can drop it gently by pressing your secondary trigger again. Pick up some stuff and toss it. All right. See if you can stack some stuff to climb up here.
Character lighting. In the first year of development, we were struggling to get our characters to feel as realistic as we wanted them to. There were actually quite a number of different problems, all of which eventually required specific technological and artistic improvements to fix. The first major problem was lighting. At the time, lighting technology in games had many shortcuts, some due to performance, but many due to misunderstandings of how it all works. To make characters look good at the time, models and textures had to be created with much of their lighting solution baked into them, like shadows and glossiness. The characters looked cool, but they also looked like video game characters. We started building Alex with this approach, because that was how you were supposed to do it. We used the baked solutions and lit her like a movie actor, essentially as if she had a custom lighting rig that followed her around and ensured she always looked good. But it didn't really work. The range of lighting environments and the dynamic nature of video games meant that she'd look great in some environments, but always end up looking terribly unrealistic at some point. We tried iterating on our lighting rig, increasing its capabilities, but eventually it felt like we were at a dead end. Returning to the drawing board, we decided to try a different approach. We built her and the lighting and the textures from the ground up, throwing everything away, focusing on not on what we wanted her to look like in her ideal lighting, but on how things were supposed to work in the real world. It might seem obvious, but it wasn't how it was done, at least not in video games. When looked at outside the game's renderer, these models and textures actually looked worse than the previous versions, but we managed to methodically pull out all the shortcuts and misconceptions about how light and texture and graphics cards worked and put it all back together. After all that was done, when we were finally able to look at Alex in-game with her new models and textures in a dynamic environment that kept her visually consistent at all times, well, she looked great. Totally seamless and part of the Half-Life 2 world. Facial technology. We wanted players to care about our characters, and to even have a chance at achieving that, we knew we had to invest a lot of technology for our characters' faces. It's well understood that humans are wired to pay attention to faces, subconsciously reading all kinds of information from them, so it's an extremely high bar, and if we couldn't reach it, we'd probably push players away from our characters, not towards them as we hoped. We started out doing a lot of research. It was not heartening. The best examples we could find weren't anywhere near close to being able to be run in real time, while the best real-time ones weren't close to the quality we wanted. We wanted to look as good as an animated movie, but they often took hours to render frames and were totally linear, authored by up to 100 animators, whereas ours had to be dynamic. A character might be trying to speak dialogue or a facial move derived from a player's actions and created by just a handful of artists. These requirements eventually led us to Dr. Paul Ekman's facial acting coding system, a system for taxonomizing human facial movements done back in the 1970s. It gave us a vocabulary for describing facial movements throughout our tools and code, and a target to aim for when designing our characters' faces. With it as a framework, we started a many-year process of iterating on how we built faces and heads of our characters. Where others had tried taking bits of Ekman's work, we wanted to try to use it all. That meant a lot of time spent figuring out how to do each piece within the tight performance constraints we had. But we also spent a lot of time just looking at people and faces, trying to find the extra features that would add the most value, like skin elasticity, teeth shadowing. In the end, while we weren't able to do everything we wanted, we did manage to get the pieces we thought were the most important to a convincing facial performance level on our characters. Eye shader. Another critical part of getting character faces to be convincing was in the eyes. Humans are great at reading eyes. There's a part of your brain dedicated to it, down to knowing where somebody is looking based on the reflections on the eyeballs. But there are all kinds of subtleties that matter. Eyes aren't actually spheres. Eyelids get distorted by the cornea moving around underneath. Eye movement can increase the odds of blinking. Eyes don't actually line up directly behind the pupil. They're shifted slightly. All these little details might feel small or unnoticeable, but the absence hurts the believability of the character. We worked on eyes for a long time, iterating our eyeball model and feature set little by little. Some things required external interfaces, like what things in the environment were interesting to look at, where others were automatic, at a subconscious level in the AI, like blinking, an obvious requirement, but one that's subtly confusing if it's wrong. Eye reflections had a particularly large impact. They're ultimately a tiny amount of real estate on the screen, but the difference they made was enormous. We knew we were finally done when we reached the point where, with our eye shader off, a character looked like a doll, human-like, but unconvincing in some way that was hard to describe. But when we turned it on, suddenly it felt like a human was looking at us.
Moving the gravity gun. When the gravity gun was first prototyped, we planned to give it to the player midway through the game. But as playtesting progressed, we saw the strength of its design and realized the gravity gun and, more importantly, the ability to launch saw blades at zombie faces needed to come earlier. That meant Eli's lab also needed to move earlier too. It was a significant change, but it was crucial to Half-Life 2's success. It serves as a good reminder that storytelling and gameplay are intertwined, and neither can always take priority. They have to work together.
Now let me call Dog. He loves to play fetch. Dog! Come! Doggy. Gordon, this is Dog. My dad built him to protect me when I was a kid. First model was about yay high. I've been adding to him ever since. Haven't I, boy? Okay, Dog, let's play catch with Gordon. You'll need to use the gravity gun. Go ahead, Dog. Throw! Good catch! Throw another, Dog. Awesome! Another one, Dog. Excellent. Dog, go get your ball! Who'd be fetching, did I? Scanners! Combine sweeping the area! Gotta head back to the lab. Come on, Gordon!
Risk. Looking back on Half-Life 2 now, 20 years later, it's sobering to reflect on how terrifying it was throughout much of the development. Game development is hard. You never really get what you'd like to have, which is be able to validate risk before you start to pile more on top of it. For example, our facial animation technology, it took probably 3 or 4 years of work before we were confident it was actually going to work, but we couldn't wait until then. In that first year, we immediately started making all kinds of other choices in our game design, our asset production, and our other technologies, all based on the assumption that our facial animation technology was going to work in the end, from a quality and performance standpoint. If it hadn't, many of those other choices wouldn't have worked either. At the same risk profile is true of other large choices we made early on. We can't wait. We just have to build and hope that our guesses will be true years from now. Terrifying.
Doc, come! Dad! It's Alex! Do you read?
Alex! Honey.
What's going on in there?
Where are you, Alex?
We're in the scrapyard airlock, stuck in a full auto cycle.
Is Gordon still with you?
He's right here.
Good. I want you to...
Dad?
Take Gordon out of here. Head for the coast. Do not go through Raven...
Dad? Dad! Damn it! Dog, open the airlock. Get us out of here. Hurry, now! Tear it apart if you have to. Just get it open! That's enough, Dog. Come on, Gordon. Come on! Gordon, you need to get out of here. I can't leave my father. Dog, Ravenholm tunnel, then circle around and try to meet up with me. Hurry!
As we finished up our work on Ravenholm, we couldn't shake the feeling that the transition from Eli's lab just wasn't working. It was far too abrupt. Eli's lab connected directly to the streets of the town where you'll be shortly, and the section you're standing in didn't exist. We had just made this promise at the end of Eli's lab: we don't go there anymore. And we liked the overall build-up we'd created. But when the player got to Ravenholm, they were immediately dropped into combat with zombies without any room for tension building. So we built this section and the subsequent tight corridors to address that in a way we were happy with. We slowed the pacing, focused on art and lighting, and got you ready to experience why we don't go to Ravenholm anymore.
Ravenholm Gameplay Focus. After watching many playtests of Ravenholm, we knew the core gameplay of the level revolved around the gravity gun and physics. Once equipped with that knowledge, we felt we could appropriately build the transition into Ravenholm and help the player learn and understand a bit about what the upcoming experience would be. This happens often. We build the level track, figure out what's working, and then design its prologue. We built the following set of rooms with that table setting in mind. The brutality of the tools we provide the player seemed to aid in setting the mood we were striving for, helping to shift the tone from the safety of Eli's lab to something darker and more frightening.
Bringing physics to the enemies. The physics traps in Ravenholm were some of the first gameplay elements in the level that we were really happy with, but they lacked player agency. It was the saw blades that helped us figure out what Ravenholm was truly about. With saw blades, the player was able to bring physics to the zombies instead of leading zombies into the physics. Once we had that understanding, Ravenholm evolved rapidly. We kept combing through the map, looking for anything, especially anything unusual, that could be turned into a tool or weapon for the player.
Player tools. By this point in the game, players have a lot of experience with Half-Life 2's physics, but they've just received the gravity gun, which provides a whole new way to interact with the physics objects in the game. We iterated on a variety of the physics objects that the player could play with, things like saw blades, the catapults, explosive canisters, traps, spears, and so on, and honed in on the ones that worked well with the physics gun and cut the ones that didn't. Then we went about stripping the levels of ammunition items so that the player had to rely on these objects to survive.
For it was said, they had become like the peculiar demons which dwell in matter, but in whom no light may be found.
Contrived setups. There's a pretty obvious contrivance in a bunch of the gravity gun and physics object training. The player pulls a saw blade out of the wall with the gravity gun, and right on cue, a zombie stumbles around the corner, just begging to have a saw blade launched at it. Then the player crawls under a spinning blade trap to turn it off, and suddenly 3 zombies appear, taunting the player to switch the trap back on. We didn't have much time to iterate on this section, so we needed setups that worked for all players, not more open-ended ones that relied on them making the right move. While this kind of design has the potential to reduce players' creativity, in this case, we found that they didn't seem to mind that we forced their hand a little bit.
Like smoke, and my bones are parched like ice, and let all my impurities be as fuel and fire until nothing remains but the light alone.
Paint cans. Once we started to succeed at making the gravity gun and physics gameplay the core of the Ravenholm experience, we started to go through the levels and look for objects that we might have overlooked as we were busy working with the really aggressive things like saw blades and exploding canisters. One of the things we found was the paint can, and it was simple enough for us to sort of reinforce player expectations by having the paint can splatter paint on the zombies when you threw one at them.
Ravenholm's development. We began developing Ravenholm early in the production of Half-Life 2, so it went through more than one full development pass. The first version predated the gravity gun, with gameplay focused on traditional zombie combat using guns and some of the physics traps. We even planned to showcase Ravenholm at E3 in 2002, but the game was ultimately unveiled a year later in 2003. By that point, we had invested heavily in Ravenholm's art, something which we generally avoid until the gameplay is fully proven. So once we went back to Ravenholm with the gravity gun mechanic in mind, we were working with a lot of pre-existing level geometry that had been designed with a very different gameplay goal in mind.
Misteaching flinches. Another memorable playtest and example of the danger of misteaching players occurred in Ravenholm. One of our design principles is for the game to respond to the player as much as possible. So when designing the gravity gun, it seemed obvious that if the player pointed it at a zombie and pulled the trigger, something should happen. It was simple enough to make it zap the zombie for a tiny amount of damage, causing the zombie to play its flinch animation, which felt good and responsive. Later, we watched a playtest where the tester discovered this interaction immediately upon arriving in Ravenholm, and interpreted it as a feedback that the gravity gun was hurting the zombie, which it was, just not very much. So they zapped the zombie again, repeatedly, shocking it over and over until it died. This is a slow, unfun, inhumane way to fight zombies, especially where you're surrounded by saw blades and explosive canisters. Having learned our lesson, we removed that flinch animation, even though it meant losing that interaction between the zombie and the gravity gun. In this case, it was better to not have the simple interaction rather than give the false impression that the gravity gun was an effective way to fight zombies. Even simple principles can require trade-offs when you get into the details.
Grigori Plaza. This open plaza is one of the areas that was fully detailed in our first development pass, and when we returned to it, we wanted to preserve as much of the existing art as possible while designing a new player path that used all 3 dimensions, moving players up and down, through windows, across rooftops, and between buildings. It wasn't a large space, so we had to squeeze as much track out of it as possible, and since that started as an art-focused area, it was light on gameplay and we needed to address that playtesters tended to fly right through it. And to top that off, it was already pushing our rendering performance budget with little room left for anything new. The challenge became finding small additions to slow the player down by adding threats around corners and into every nook and cranny of the level.
But who is this? Another life to save? I'll keep my eye on you. More than that, I cannot promise.
Fire trap. This fire trap was originally intended as a visual showpiece for the fire system before a level designer repurposed it as a gameplay element for Ravenholm. It was almost cut many times during development due to the performance impact on the low-end PCs because of all the overdraw involved with the transparent sprites. In the end, there was a programmer who felt that it was important enough to the gameplay that it was worth doing the work to solve the performance issues and make sure we could get it into the game.
Hallway cupboards. These junk-filled hallways were a simple solution to our need to slow the player down. With the constraint of preserving as much of the existing geometry as possible, combined with slow-moving zombies as the main enemy, it was tricky to stop players from just sprinting through here. Luckily, having Grigori as the crazed inhabitant of Ravenholm made these setups easy to justify. It makes good sense that he'd clog the stairwell to keep himself safe on the rooftops. In the end, Grigori's solution and ours are one and the same. Just throw a bunch of furniture in the way, because if it stops zombies, it'll probably slow the player down too.
Poison head crabs. This room unintentionally introduces poison head crabs. We'd spent a lot of time crafting their proper introduction later in the level, but once we saw how well they were playtesting, our excitement got the better of us, and before too long we'd scattered them throughout the level. By the time we realized they'd appeared before their intro, it was really too late to rework it. Fortunately, a tight room of poison head crabs works as decent training, because their design avoids a common issue with combat training. Typically, players are stressed and they can get frustrated if they die repeatedly without understanding why. And sure enough, we encountered that problem when trying to train the player with both poison head crabs and their source, the poison zombie. However, poison head crabs can't kill the player by themselves, so while stressful, a room full of them at least avoids that frustration.
Even with all the work we did to try and make a connection between this lever and the outside electric fence in the players' minds, some testers would still flip the lever and not know what they'd done. They'd even wander around, flip the lever back on, and wander around some more. With not much time to spend on making the connection clearer, we elected to just have the lever break off. This prevented players from undoing their progress and added to the feeling that Ravenholm was an unreliable and decaying environment.
Well done, brother. Make free use of my traps, but take care not to fall in them yourself. Behind you! In Ravenholm, you do well to be vigilant.
We all went to Ravenholm. When fans talk to us about Half-Life 2, Ravenholm is often the most remembered section. Thanks to its multiple development passes and the density of the material in it, more members of the team are represented in Ravenholm than anywhere else. It was where we figured out how to apply our artistic pipeline to the set pieces and mood we wanted, how physics and gameplay combined with the gravity gun, how headcrabs and zombies need to evolve for Half-Life 2, and much more. Looking back on it now, it reassures our belief in individual empowerment over centralized design. Ravenholm is dense, highly efficient in its gameplay and artistic execution, and the sum of many small contributions by individuals who understood how they could push it just a little further with their own unique capabilities.
Car crushers. These car crushers required some adjustments and quite a bit of work to our physics damage system. There's always a challenge when big physics objects interact with non-player characters. For instance, if the physics can push the NPC, it might shove them somewhere they're not supposed to go, leaving them unable to recover. This isn't a big issue for something like a headcrab, which can just hop out of a tricky situation, but for something like a zombie, it could mean they get stuck and end up helpless, flailing away in whatever gap they manage to wedge themselves into, which kind of kills the survival horror mood we're going for here.
Car Crusher lifts. Getting the car crushers to lift the player was also tricky. See, the player is always being simulated by both the physics system and the game's movement system. Each time we update the player's state, we compare the results from both systems and decide which one is right, then sync them up and repeat. This allows the two systems to influence each other. Like when the player stands on a seesaw, the physics lets the board give way, or when they stand on the car crusher, it lifts them up. While more complex, this dual system approach was easier to tune than trying to handle both physics and player movement in a single system. By keeping them separate, we could fine-tune the player movement system to feel good on its own, only reconciling the two when physics was affecting the player.
Better and better. I am Father Grigori. You have already met my congregation. Hold me tightly, child. Ah, it is you, brother. I apologize. But well done. My bullets are the least of your concerns. The grave holds nothing worse for you.
Pacing switch. Now that the player's through the training section, we can start shifting the pacing from moody, claustrophobic spaces to more combat-focused action arenas. With the player familiar with the various physics tools in the environment, we can start mixing those into open spaces and just give the player the freedom to choose their approach.
Detected.
Although they call me crazy, I care not, for thou art my neighbor.
Tables and bodies. Towards the end of Ravenholm's production, with all the major pieces in place, we went through and tried to fill out every bit of empty space with something interesting. In doing so, we had to be careful to use what we already had and not create anything new, as we couldn't risk introducing more bugs. Often, as in this room, we were trying to add new moments of gameplay, while also adding more detail and storytelling to the area. Small scenes like this allow an attentive player to think about what they're seeing and what it might mean for what they'll encounter next.
Fast Zombie Introduction. This space was another area originally built for E3 2003, where it showcased the player fighting against a squad of Combine soldiers. When we returned to use it to introduce the Fast Zombie, we tried to keep as much of the previous work as possible. We wanted an iconic moonlit shot with zombies leaping past the moon like werewolves to draw the player's eye. Once that beat is over, we introduce the first Fast Zombie to the player space and send it at them. It took a lot of iteration to find the right balance of lighting for the scene to look good, while ensuring it also worked for the gameplay goals.
Physics object consistency. All physics objects have a variety of parameters that define their behavior, their mass, the amount of damage they take before breaking, what they break into, and so on. During development, these parameters were specified by level designers for each item, which is how most things in the game worked. But later in development, we realized we'd created a problem for ourselves. There were thousands of physics objects in the game, and no method to ensure consistency across them. As a result, a cardboard box might break apart with a single pistol shot in one level, and be completely invulnerable in another. Internally, we generally referred to these inconsistencies as level designer crimes. To fix these, and to deliver some justice, we built a system that enforced consistency on all physics objects based on their visual model. Since most of the game had already been built, we were forced to allow level designers to explicitly opt out of this system for rare edge cases where they needed to do something criminal to preserve what they'd designed. Internally, we refer to these designers as recidivists, some of whom perpetuate their life of crime at Valve to this day.
Here, brother! Come closer. You've stirred up hell. A man after my own heart. Here, I have a more suitable gun for you. You'll need it. Catch! Good. Now, keep it close. My advice to you is, aim for the head. Hush. They come. There is no rest in Ravenholm. Move on and I will meet you at the church. I think no worse of thee.
Poison Zombie Introduction. Constraining the player in a tight space while providing them with a view outward is a useful way to increase the chances that they'll notice something we want them to see. Here, we draw the player's attention with the sound of a wail before the poison zombie itself becomes visible. Originally, this encounter was also the first time players faced poison headcrabs, but as mentioned in an earlier node, we got far too enthusiastic in proliferating poison headcrabs around the level and ended up spoiling their joint introduction here. In the end, however, these first encounters worked better as separate instances anyway.
Gamma correction. Our game engine has a rendering system that's responsible for taking the entire state of the game and calculating a color value for every pixel on your screen to represent that state. But code and software from other people are involved in the process of calculating those pixels as well. As an example, the software and hardware in your GPU and monitor. At one point during development, we were unhappy with how our characters looked. In particular, we thought that they looked waxy or sickly. Their skin was wrong. We spent some time tuning our lighting, but we just couldn't get both our characters and our world to look right. Luckily, we still had a fully featured software renderer, which allowed us to run the game without a GPU, because this was an era where many players still didn't have one. And looking at the game on that renderer, we noticed that our lighting didn't have the same problem. So we went through our code with a fine-tooth comb, trying to figure out where our rendering code was doing something wrong when it was working with a GPU. After failing to do so, we tried talking to the GPU manufacturers, asking them to double-check they weren't doing anything wrong with the pixel values we were passing them. That was the start of a long journey, and long story short, it was a journey of almost 2 years of back-and-forth communication with GPU manufacturers before we were able to convince them that they were doing gamma correction incorrectly in the low-level math on their cards. During this, we'd even had to build a system that validated the color values of an individual pixel throughout the entirety of our rendering pipeline. But eventually, at the end, we finally got new drivers back from them, and our characters immediately looked like they should, matching the software renderer.
At this point in Ravenholm, the player has learned all the gameplay elements available to them and can predict their interactions. This allows us to build more complex setups, providing a greater level of threat and more freedom in how the player can approach each scenario. This arena is a deliberately entwined space that the player will need to explore, and we use that exploration time to slowly ramp up combat intensity. The faster the player explores, the faster we ramp it up. The freeform nature of this design made it challenging to tune, given the large dynamic range in how players played through it.
Systems engaged. Emergency. User dead imminent.
Playtester archetypes. Iteration and regular playtest were the lifeblood of Half-Life 2's production. Every week, we quietly watch over the shoulder of a player going through the section we were working on, taking notes on what worked and what didn't. It was important for us to test with a wide range of skill levels to be sure that we weren't making decisions that only worked for some. Over time, we learned to choose specific types of playtesters based on the development stage we were at. Early on, we used experienced gamers, usually teammates, who could handle rough, unfinished areas and were good at explaining their thought process. For combat testing, we'd find players of all skill levels, especially those creative in their usage with the tools. Finally, as sections became more polished, we'd focus on beginners, people who didn't play games much or weren't familiar with first-person shooters. Even if they weren't necessarily someone who might buy the game, we often learned something valuable from watching them.
Final Arena. When we finished the first pass over Ravenholm, this rooftop was intended to be the culminating fight. Like other spaces in Ravenholm, it had begun life as a space. Final Arena. When we finished the first pass over Ravenholm, this rooftop was intended to be the culminating fight. Like other spaces in Ravenholm, it had begun life as a space purely focused on being an interesting visual location. We felt it was important that, as the player left Ravenholm, they had a moment to look back over the town they had just survived and get a glimpse of where they were headed next. Multiple gameplay groups took a shot at building a fight here, but the tight geometry and performance constraints meant we never really created a finale we were happy with. Not unlike the Half-Life saga itself, it seemed as if Ravenholm was destined to not have a final arena. When we finished final arena.
Ah, there you are. At last. I will send the cart for you, brother. It will be but a moment. Patience, brother. Guard yourself well. Almost there, brother. No, brother, step into the cart. The handbrake, brother. Release it and come down. Greetings, brother. And so we meet at last. You are to be commended for avoiding my traps. The work of a man who once had too much time on his hands and now finds time for nothing but the work of salvation. I suspect you have little wish to remain in Ravenholm, so I will show you to the mines. As for me, a shepherd must tend to his flock, especially when they have grown unruly. Follow me, brother, and tread lightly, for this is hallowed ground.
Response rules. We knew early on that we wanted a lot of dynamic dialogue in-game, so we needed a system to handle it effectively. We aimed for a system that allowed sound designers to add and tweak lines without involving programmers, made the dialogue tightly responsive to the game's state, and minimized repetition. With these requirements, we created the response rules system. Whenever a character speaks outside of a choreographed scene, this system determines which line to deliver. Rather than picking up lines directly, character AI is constantly flagging opportunities for speech whenever a relevant event happens. Spotting the player, getting hurt, firing a last round in a gun, encountering overwhelming enemies, and so on. With each opportunity, it sends the response rules system a packet of data about the game's current state, and the system returns the most fitting dialogue line, if there is any. This setup allowed our sound designers to create a detailed decision matrix for dialogue. For example, a character might have a different set of lines for announcing a reload while under fire versus after the end of a fight, or if only one ally is left standing, or if there's a strider in sight, etc. By the time we shipped Half-Life 2, we felt we'd only scratched the surface of this system's potential. It became a core feature of Episode 1's Alex, and went on to power the dynamic dialogue in our later games, including TF2's classes and the cast of Left 4 Dead.
The real final arena. Very late in the development of Half-Life 2, when we were reviewing the entire game for final improvement opportunities, we decided we did, in fact, want a real finale for Ravenholm. The rooftop fight wasn't enough. After some discussion, we chose to add this final fight through the graveyard with Grigori alongside the player. It was risky, development-wise, but we felt the game needed it. Since we were near the end of production, we had a mature set of gameplay tools to work with. But even more importantly, by this point, we understood our own game. Making a game is often a process of learning what it is you're actually creating. Why is our game fun? How is it different? What are the most important elements? As we built the game and watched playtesters go through it, we learned answers to those questions and, in turn, got better at making it. So the graveyard came together quickly and required far less iteration than many earlier areas of the game.
Aim for the head. You meant no harm. Come! Lend a hand, brother! Return to your true nature. Be free, my child. assistance, bro. Woe betide thee, child. I think no worse of thee. Yes, when it is I. Follow me. Quickly, brother. I remember your true face. Hurry while I hold the gate! Go quickly! Farewell, brother! I fear I deliver you to a darker place. May the light of lights illuminate your path. Look to your own salvation.
The complex route the player takes to safely navigate this mineshaft gives them plenty of time to see what's waiting for them at the bottom. And surprise, it's headcrabs. Honestly, it's often headcrabs. But in this case, it's poison headcrabs, which are fun by themselves, but a real riot when you add fast headcrabs into the mix. These two guys make a great combination. Neither is particularly dangerous on its own, but together they're incredibly lethal. Once poisoned, a single hit from a fast headcrab is enough to kill the player. And this is what biologists call symbiosis. At least that's what we think.